yeah, just looking forward to a productive and hopefully useful conversation to your work and our shared work for freedom and liberation for all people in this moment. Yeah, so I will be speaking for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll launch into discussion and questions. But as they said, as I talk, feel free to just leave questions in the chat or in the Q&A function under Zoom. So there's three primary things I'd like people to understand even from my talk, even if you just listen to the first 2 minutes. The first thing is that we are just in a very dire moment of shrinking political space, both for Black liberation and for Palestinian liberation. In the case of Palestine, we see increasing normalization between countries such as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain with Israel. We see the Trump administration really pushing it every possible way, from trying to end the possibility of right of return for refugees, to moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, to attacking the right to boycott or support BDS movements in the US and even around the world. So from every lens, there's a big movement to kind of liquidate the Palestinian struggle in this moment that we actively need to resist. Similarly, as we all know, just looking at the events of this year, after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police, we're also in a moment of just dire situations for the conditions of Black people in this country. The protests and the uprisings that emerged after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed really demonstrate that police brutality continues to be as much of an issue for Black people in this country as it was 50 years ago, as lynching was 100 years ago, and really requires a lot of deep transformational political work, largely along the lines of abolition, in order to create conditions where Black people can live with freedom and dignity. As a result of how serious the situation is, which I might add is serious regardless of who is elected in about 3 weeks, we are facing conditions of just climate destabilization, conditions where working people are earning less and less, while major corporations and billionaires earn more and more, pushing us to have to work harder and less in order to survive. We are seeing the rise of right-wing nationalism in countries around the world, including the US and Brazil, and not to mention Israel. And so what my point is that regardless of who is elected, we have a lot of work to do as people who are committed to freedom and justice for the world. And so in this context, in this dire moment, we need people of European descent to see themselves as part of a diaspora that needs to wage its own internal movement against its own legacy of colonialism and imperialism, specifically as it relates to the enslavement of Africans, the colonization of the African continent, and the division of the Middle East, which gives us the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict that we are witnessing and discussing today. But in the sense that there have been Pan-African movements for liberation and Pan-Arab movements for liberation, we also need our European family to understand that those of you who live in the United States who are descendants of Europeans are in relation with those who live in Europe and are the descendants of those who colonized the Third World, and are also in relation to the Europeans who started the Zionist movement to colonize Palestinian land. So all of these struggles and places and geographies are not separate, but rather connected under a 500-year-long legacy or more of colonialism that we actively need internal organizing to disrupt, at the same time as the colonized are also working to free ourselves from these systems. And so in this context, in the so-called United States, or what Indigenous people refer to as Turtle Island, we need more support for projects that open up the prospects of waging freedom in a moment where those prospects are rapidly closing. And I'll say more about this as we talk further, but many of these projects that are opening up spaces for freedom in the Black and Palestinian movements are frequently maligned or pushed to the side of our political discourse and conversations. And so that's what I want us to be focusing on, is the revolutionary projects happening in each movement that are often ignored, but seriously need support. This will be a little bit interactive in terms of media. I have a few different things to share with you. Let's just see how this works. Yeah, so this is just continuing some of the key points that I'd like you all to take away from our time together. Hold on a moment. These are kind of out of order. The first being that the world we are in is the result of the imagination primarily of Europeans who saw fit to come to a new continent to colonize an entire series of land masses and people, the result of which was genocide, ethnic cleansing, enslavement, and displacement of indigenous Africans and indigenous so-called Americans. And that this is not the only vision of the world in which we can live. That for centuries, the colonized people of the world, the so-called wretched of the earth, have had dreams of entirely different forms of societies, of relating to their communities and to other peoples and struggles around the world. And so part of our task is to envision a new world, or in the case where the vision is already clear from the work of African and Palestinian and other third world liberation movements, to try to make those visions a reality instead of the current one that we're stuck in. The next point that I'd like people to understand is that one of the primary needs of this moment focuses on notions of repair. The political movement for reparations has been a very prominent part of our conversations in the last few months. But I want us to think of what that really means in the word that's embedded in reparations, which is repair. It's repair, as I said, for centuries of colonialism, centuries of racial violence, centuries of disenfranchisement and forced impoverishment. And this is a kind of universal principle that the world has yet to put in play for really any victim of colonialism, specifically though for Black and Palestinian people. The next thing I hope people take away from this is that the core injustice against Palestinians is not occupation. Occupation is very important, but the root issue is forced exile and dispossession as the result of Zionist colonization of Palestinian land, which is a broader part of the European division of the so-called Middle East. And the last kind of primary point to take away is that divide and conquer is a system that is in place in the United States and in Israel-Palestine, which makes it beneficial in ways for those who are not the most oppressed to side with systems of oppression, because there's an illusion of having some level of safety or security or even power. However, at the end of the day, these systems of divide and conquer and systems of oppression keep everybody oppressed, even those who think they have some degree of safety or security. And I can say more about this later, but when we think about how divide and conquer operates, it's when you pit, let's say, the middle class against poor and working class people, or where you pit white people against people of color. And so each of these forces is in play in the United States at this moment. Each of these forces is also in play in occupied Palestine, and are dynamics that we urgently need to disrupt in order to do our important political work. So just some other grounding context. Let's see, where is this? I'm not going to talk very much about Black Palestinian solidarity in the last era. There's many things that I could say about this, and it is very interesting. However, you don't need to know the details of the history of the relationship between these struggles in order to understand that they're each fundamentally movements for self-determination and freedom that are very urgently worthy of your support. But I do want to take us to this moment at this point 50 years ago, at the height of the Third World Liberation Movement, where you had the revolutionary forces of the Black Panther Party in direct conversation with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this is in a moment in Algeria, shortly after they were able to successfully resist and expel their French colonizers after 130 years of occupation. I want to highlight this moment because it is, for me, this is the type or the level of struggle and solidarity that I am trying to contribute to rebuilding. Each of our movements has been significantly weakened and targeted since this revolutionary moment in the 60s and 70s, to the point where we're very relatively weak and isolated. But it's only through intentional organization that we can build our forces to be as strong again, to the point where liberation movements can actually have representative parties and to support each other. And so there's a few notions that I just want people to be sure people understand. The first is to be very, 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 very clear that the country in which I'm assuming most of us are viewing this conversation from is a prime example of stolen land, occupied land, and colonialism. And specifically, a form of colonialism called settler colonialism, where an external population moves in its people and slowly but surely takes over the land, pushing out the indigenous population. So many of you are familiar with the map of disappearing Palestine, which shows how Palestinian land slowly, well, not even that slowly, but how Palestinian land was recast as Israeli land over a period of 70 or so years. But I'm not sure how many people have looked at the map of the so-called United States in the same kind of way. And so I just want to be very clear that colonialism is something that is not just part of our past, that there are still millions of indigenous Americans who are by and large confined to tiny reservations on undesirable pieces of land, and who for centuries have been denied their right to live in the right to self-determination, which means the right to determine how your own community operates, to have the resources that are necessary for you to survive without being forced into the economic, political, or social systems of an occupying force. So I view the United States as an occupying force in the same way that I view Israel as an occupying force of Palestinian land. Other ways of thinking about this, this is a map that maybe some of you have seen before, that kind of tries to transplant the map of disappearing Palestine onto other countries. However, in this map is actually, what's the word? It's an inappropriate kind of analogy to make for 3 out of 4 of the countries on this in this graphic, because just like the United States, Canada, Australia, and Israel are all forms of settler colonies where Europeans came and displaced indigenous populations. And we tend to view these countries as democratic, as being part of the West, even though Australia is actually part of the far, far, far East. And even though Canada and the United States are part of an entire continent of the Americas where Europeans are not indigenous to. And so this disappearing map has actually happened for indigenous people in the United States, in Canada, and in Australia. And so the reason that I bring this up is to say that when we fight for freedom and liberation for Black and Palestinian people, it's part of a process of undoing legacies of colonialism that have impacted indigenous people around the world. And just to reiterate this a little further, this is a graphic of the so-called border between the United States and Mexico, as well as the so-called border between Palestine and Israel. And in each case, these borders were not put in place by the indigenous people of these lands, but by occupying forces who were seeking to maintain their power and control over land that does not belong to them. And so the indigenous people wind up being criminalized in each case. And when I say indigenous, I mean this in the broadest sense possible. It is not just the indigenous populations who lived in the land that became the United States before it became the United States, I mean the indigenous people of the entire Americas. So the migrants that we see fleeing conflict in Honduras and Nicaragua and Mexico and other places who are migrating into the United States are indigenous people. And the reason that they are fleeing is because the United States, as a colonial and imperial force, has destabilized their own homelands to the point where it's unsafe for them to live. And so it is their right as people who are indigenous to the Americas to seek refuge in other parts of the Americas. And in a different scenario where there was indigenous sovereignty over these lands and these borders were not exist in the ways as strict and yeah, just as strict as they do today. Just from understanding how indigenous people operate and have a sense of collective solidarity for the collective well-being of the planet and all who inhabit it. I do not think that the indigenous peoples of Southwest United States would turn their backs on people fleeing from further south in order to seek safety. So I just want to be very clear that indigenous is a very kind of broad category in this context. So I'd like to spend a few minutes or more than a few minutes just talking through a few articles that I've recently written that speak to some of the needs of this moment, both for the Black struggle and for Palestine. Each of these articles can be found in the Electronic Intifada. The first is an article that I wrote in June of this year as the uprising and series of protests began, about how Palestine advocates can support the Black struggle. Because this was a question that, that many of us Black activists were hearing from our Palestinian comrades. Because in the last, actually I can take a step back. I'll just do a quick picture overview of what happened in the last 6 years. But in the summer of 2014, we witnessed at the same time the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, the subsequent uprising of the people, and Israel's last major war on the Gaza Strip, in which over 2,000 people were killed in an act of collective punishment. And so at the same time, we saw military tanks and SWAT police occupying Ferguson, and we saw the war on Gaza. And one of the things that became very clear in this moment is that not only were there kind of experiential connections in the suffering of Black people and Palestinians in terms of experiencing state racism and violence, there were also material connections between these struggles, where the tear gas that was used against protesters in Ferguson was the same tear gas that the Israelis used against Palestinian protesters, and that Egypt was using against its own protesters. And all of this tear gas was manufactured by a company that is in Pennsylvania, occupied territory in Pennsylvania. We also saw at this moment, it was brought to the surface in a deeper way, the exchange of police and so-called intelligence or counter-revolutionary information between the United States and Israel, where the chief of police in St. Louis had, just a few years prior to the Ferguson uprising, attended a training in Israel that's meant to help share information about how to repress kind of minority and protesting populations in a more coordinated way. And so this is the context in which we see Black Lives Matter activists visiting Palestine. We see Palestinians coming to visit Ferguson and other sites of the Black struggle. We see a large growth in student and youth activism, not just for Palestinian rights, but with an intersectional approach that combines the call to divest from the occupation with calls to divest from prisons and police, and to divest from infrastructure that supports the maintenance of the colonial border, which includes deportations and immigrant prisons. So this is, again, in late 2014, early 2015, when we see the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we also see that these activists, and this is a picture I'm kind of right there, of about 68 Stanford students occupying the San Mateo Bridge in the San Francisco Bay Area on Martin Luther King Day. And we were very intentional to say that at the same time as we're protesting against state violence and racism in the United States, that Palestine is a central kind of part of that global struggle and set of conversations. So this is kind of the context I wanted to share. But so in the last kind of 5 to 6 years, as a result of this moment, we've seen a resurgence in Black solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. However, as a result of George Floyd's murder and the subsequent uprisings, we as Black activists began to get a lot of questions from our Palestinian comrades about how they can support us in this moment. So this is the context of this article that I wrote. And so one of the main kind of questions that people were seeking guidance on is how do we engage in solidarity in a way that is not just rhetorical, that like, here's my Black Lives Matter sign in my window or my front lawn, but how do I actually tangibly show up for Black communities? And so the first point that I think is important to understand is something I've spoken to a little bit already, but just understanding that at its core, the Black struggle is not simply a civil rights struggle of 50 or 100 or 150 years. At its core, it's a 500-year struggle against United States colonialism and imperialism, and it's a struggle for self-determination. What do I mean by that? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen at times so I can speak to you more directly. What I mean by that is that people who today are referred to as Black people or African Americans never had any consent in the process of becoming Americans. We were kidnapped as indigenous Africans from the continent. We were brought to the territory of the Americas, whether what became the United States or what we know as the Caribbean, or even Latin America and South America. And for 200 years existed under a system of slavery, or at least 200 years. And even when this moment ended, we were not asked or given an option, do you want to become citizens of this country that colonized and occupied you? Do you want your own set of land and ability to determine your own political, social, and economic systems? Do you want to repatriate or try to repatriate into the lands in which you came from? We were just, citizenship was put upon us. And this is similar to the condition of Palestinians living inside Israel today, who did not ask to become Israeli citizens, but who became such as a result of being able to remain in a certain territory in a moment of Zionist colonization and occupation. And so what I want people to understand is that the territory and country in which we live is built on an illegitimate system of colonialism, ethnic cleansing, enslavement, and that it requires the continuous subjugation of Black and Indigenous people in order to maintain its power. So the United States would not have become a world power if it was not able to reap massive profits from the slave trade and from the enslavement of Africans. And if it was not able to amass such wide resources, natural resources, by colonizing indigenous land. And so these are the resources that provide the US with the money and the ability to then dominate the rest of the world, including its imperial domination of the Middle East. The next thing to understand is that when the central premise of this point is that Israel is not unique in what it's doing, and to be wary or to avoid kind of exceptionalizing Israel or even demonizing Israel in a way that presents its violence or oppression as unique. And so we look at settlers in the West Bank, and we understand that they are violating international law and are often very racist and violent towards Palestinians. But we also need to understand that because this continent itself is occupied and colonized, that those who are not indigenous and those who are not Black, because Black people had literally no choice in being on this territory, are also either settlers or the descendants of settlers. At the very least, you are participating in an active project of colonization of another many sets of people's lands that requires their subjugation. And so, what one point to understand here is that that doesn't mean that people who live here as settlers cannot also experience oppression. And this is true in both cases here in the United States and in occupied Palestine. In the United States, we have seen a very kind of long history of different ethnic groups experiencing forms of oppression or discrimination from the very beginning, whether that is the way that Irish, Italians, European Jews were treated and the end of the 1800s or beginning of the 1900s, whether it's how Chinese and Japanese laborers were treated, or Japanese people were interned in camps during World War II, even to the experience of Arab or different Latin American populations today, where they experience immense amounts of state violence and discrimination. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the way the divide and conquer system of the United States is set up is a way in which new immigrants spend some period of time experiencing some form of hardship. But as long as they sort of agree to support the American project of colonialism on this land and white supremacy and erasure of indigenous people and oppression of African people, they're given a certain set of rights, privileges, and comfort. They're able to become Americans in ways that it's structurally impossible for Black people or indigenous people to be. And what I mean by this is because this country is rooted in the literal oppression and genocide of our peoples, there is no way for us to fully be free as Black and indigenous people in ways in which a non-Black, non-indigenous immigrant group that might experience oppression at some point in time is then able to become American, achieve the American dream or so-called American dream, or even assimilate into whiteness. So again, we know that Irish, Italians, European Jews were not viewed as white at the very beginning, that it was a very kind of Anglo-Saxon project. But over time, these groups became incorporated into the project of whiteness, were able to experience some benefits and privileges in terms of getting access to land, grants for education, grants for housing, not experiencing violence from police, not being subject to hyper surveillance and mass incarceration. And all they need to do is not kind of say anything or side with the oppressed African and indigenous people who are living under these systems and who at different points in history rise up to organize against their oppression. And so this is true not just for people who became white. It can also be true for example, Arab Americans who are not Black, who are able to participate in anti-Black racism, which I'll get to in a moment. And sorry, just the last thing to say on this point is that there's a similar system of divide and conquer supremacy set up in Israel, where Arab, Middle Eastern, and Ethiopian Jewish people are indeed oppressed and experience racism by European Israelis. However, they still are given privileges of citizenship in exchange for participating in the occupation and oppression of Palestinians. And in this case, in occupied Palestine, I've heard that in cases it's the Ethiopian Israeli soldiers who can be the most brutal towards Palestinians, because as the people who are at the bottom of the Israeli racial infrastructure or hierarchy, they feel like they need to prove themselves to their European Israeli counterparts by showing how well they can oppress Palestinians. This is not to be kind of discouraging to people who are the descendants of settlers, but it's to say that you have an obligation to contribute time, labor, and resources in solidarity with indigenous and oppressed populations. The solidarity cannot simply be rhetorical of we stand with Black people or we stand with Palestinians. And so a large part of moving from rhetorical solidarity to material solidarity is, I believe, is focusing on shifting power and resources from communities that benefit from anti-Black racism, and I'll add colonialism into this mix, and investing in Black and Indigenous communities and organizing. So I wrote this article with the Arab American community in mind, because a lot of conversations were happening in the start of the uprising about just the role that Arab store owners, liquor store, gas station owners play in perpetuating anti-Black racism or exploiting or extracting money and resources from already impoverished Black communities. And this is a picture that's very clear in Detroit, where I lived for 4 years before Chicago, where we have the largest Black city in the country, bordering the largest or highest concentration of Arabs in the country. And the relationship between the communities is one that is largely, it is not a relationship that is conducive to solidarity. It's a relationship that supports the continued oppression of Black people and Black Detroiters. And what I mean by that is these gas stations and liquor stores offer very little things of nutritional value to the community, often engage in racist practices of profiling customers or viewing them as threats, and so putting up plexiglass and different security measures to protect themselves from dangerous Black people. And that this is one form of racism that people in the Arab community were seeking to address in this moment. And I will stress that this is not an issue that's specific to the Arab community. It is literally an issue that most immigrant communities or populations have to address in terms of how they relate to the Black community, where many immigrant groups, as they settle themselves in this colonial project, will first set their roots in communities that are adjacent to Black populations. They might even live in the same neighborhoods. However, as they're able to gain some levels of economic security, they might open stores in Black communities, which shifts the relationship to one of not the same, but relatively similar levels of oppression, to one in which there is a kind of merchant and customer relationship between communities, where the merchant immigrant class is able to take money from or make a living out of selling goods, often unhealthy goods, to the Black community, that builds wealth for their own families and communities. And from there, they're able to use that wealth and move out of the city into the suburbs. And it's a form of just, this is what I mean when I say that some immigrant groups can be seduced by the American Dream or project, as long as they are kind of either silent or active participants in the oppression of Black and Indigenous people. And so this is one form of racism that I think is important to address. Another form is just addressing the unacceptable conditions that Black people are living in this country. In the case of Detroit, this includes things such as water shutoffs, home foreclosures, evictions, gentrification, food apartheid, where there's literally not infrastructure for Detroiters to have access to affordable and healthy food, inadequate public health, and decades of disinvestment. So to me, it's these material forms of racism that are more important to address than trying to convince your uncle, who might have racist views, to not have those views. That is important work at the end of the day, but if we have to prioritize where and how we spend our time and resources, it should be investing in Black communities that are trying to address these issues and not just getting stuck in internal and kind of rhetorical and circular conversations about racism within our families or within our communities. So the next point, here it is yeah, so while I'm saying that we should be divesting from anti-Black racism and investing in Black self-determination, what does that mean? It means supporting Black organizations beyond just the well-known or the national ones. And it means, so for some in the Palestine Solidarity movement, activists from Black for Palestine, or Black people who are actively in support of Palestine, are among the only Black people in their political kind of networks. And this can't be, that's an unacceptable kind of situation. So we need everybody to start building relationships and supporting the organizing of the Black liberation movement in a much broader way. In every city in this country, there are Black people actively working, plotting and working towards our freedom and liberation. There's Black farmers who are working to secure land and resources so their communities can be food secure and self-sufficient. There are meeting spaces for Black radical organizations that are facing displacement due to gentrification. And then there are many groups that have no offices at all. In every city, there are former Black Panthers or elder Black revolutionaries that are seeking to transfer knowledge to future generations. And so what I offer is that I'm assuming most of you live in the Twin Cities area, to do some research and work to, if you don't know who these organizations or initiatives are, to seek them out and to support them regularly with time, with money, with office space, with you can invite them to, for example, give a lecture about their work here and pay them an honorarium to support their organization's work. But that we have to get much deeper in our level of relationships and understanding of what the Black struggle is. The next piece is that for those who have spent money and time to travel to Palestine and to see the occupation and learn from people under struggle, you can also do that same thing with Black communities and organizations that are much closer to home in Detroit and Chicago and Jackson, Mississippi. If you volunteered to defend a Palestinian's home in the West Bank from settlers, or to help kind of harvest olives, you can also volunteer time to protect a Black farmer's land from gentrification and to help them harvest their crops here. If we believe it's important to defend Palestinian homes from being demolished, we can defend Black families from being evicted. It's just the kind of practice of solidarity that we need is not something that's abstract or hard to figure out. It's already something that many of us have began to practice in relationship to Palestine. The next piece is something that I said already, but just really wanting to stress that Israel is not unique or exceptional in its violence against Palestinians. That we have to situate what's happening, what Israel does in the context of hundreds of years of European colonial violence. And so when I first, on my first delegation to Palestine in 2013, I went with a group of largely white activists, mostly college students and university professors. And after just seeing the injustice and the brutality of the occupation, many people would say, I can't believe that like Israel is so racist or that this is so bad. But for me, I was sitting there, this is 2013, the year that the year after Trayvon Martin was killed. And just with the deep understanding that, yes, what is happening to Palestinians is terrible and needs to be resisted, but that there are very many terrible things happening to Black and other oppressed populations here in the US, many times in the same cities as the places where some of my co-delegates lived, that they probably had no relationship or access to. And so just really needing to understand that, again, in this broad sense of struggle. And behind me is a map of just third world solidarity, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. And Palestine is on the African part of this map. But understanding that what's happening to Palestinians is part of a very broad and shared history of colonialism that most of the world has experienced by Europe. And so this is the legacy and issue that we need to be organizing against. And so as a corollary of this, it's important to understand that justice for the Black struggle is also about justice for the entire African diaspora, which includes reparations for slavery and colonialism. And so we can't just focus kind of domestically or internally because it's not possible for Black people to have the full conditions of freedom, of justice and repair for the violence that we experienced, without also giving those things to the entire continent and diaspora. I'm going to skip just to this next point, which is around the concept of abolition, which is something that might be a new concept to some of you over the last few weeks and months, but is actually a really centuries old concept within the Black freedom movement, which first sought abolition of slavery, which was the complete ending of a system of violence and injustice, and continues today to police and prison abolition. And so if it's hard for you to understand what abolition means in the context of the US, it might be easier for those who support Palestinian freedom to understand it from the opposite way. So if we understand that the Israeli occupation, its prisons, its settlements, its military, and its system of ethnic supremacy need to be abolished in order for Palestinian liberation to exist, then we should also understand that the occupying armies in the United States, which are the military and police, the concentration camps in the United States, which hold indigenous, immigrant, and Black prisoners, need to be abolished, and that white supremacists, the institutions of this country are white supremacist and also need to be reformed into systems that actually are rooted in justice for the oppressed populations. And so when we call for the divestment of military aid to Israel, we also need to be pushing for the divestment of funds to the forces that oppress Black, Indigenous, and poor populations in the United States, and to be investing in our social and economic well-being as oppressed people. So I'm not, yeah, you can look up this article and I'll put it actually in the chat to read the full thing. I do want to switch gears and talk about what's kind of urgent or important in the context of the Palestinian struggle in this moment. Okay, so both in Black for Palestine and just as my own individual political belief and practice, I want to stress that the right of return of Palestinian refugees is the center of justice for Palestine, and that we as solidarity activists need to put a lot more time and energy into focusing this right and helping to make it a reality. And this goes back to the picture I shared towards the beginning, where many of us are focused on the occupation as the primary issue that needs to be resolved for Palestinians to be free and live in dignity. But that's actually not the root kind of cause of the struggle. Yeah, actually, this is formatted differently, so I will speak to you as I look at this article. So the central kind of premise here is that, as I said already, we are in a very kind of dire moment for the future of Palestine. We see attacks on Palestine activists through sites such as Canary Mission, which creates a blacklist of mostly student and young pro-Palestine organizers and tries to threaten them, their employers, or even their families. We see over 30 laws in the United States that oppose the BDS movement for Palestinian freedom. And as recently as last December, Donald Trump's executive order, which defines anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine, some pro-Palestine politics as anti-Semitic in federal, what's the word, institutions. But when we think about the occupation and say that like ending the occupation means or is the equivalent of freeing Palestine, this actually misses the fundamental injustice of the Zionist project in Palestine, which is the Nakba in 1948, when at least 75% of the indigenous population became refugees who were, what I mean by this is are originally from land that is now in Israel. And after the war in 1948, were prevented from returning to their homes by the state of Israel. So for 72 years, what started as roughly 800,000 Palestinians and has ballooned to literally millions of Palestinians are in permanent and forced exile away from their homelands. And so as long as we are not talking about the right of return, centering the right of return, or making the conditions for it to be possible occur, we're actually ignoring the kind of biggest injustice that Palestinians have experienced. And so I understand some of the reasons why right of return kind of gets pushed to the side, and I want to speak to those. The first is that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and the occupation of the West Bank includes East Jerusalem, is the most visible form of Zionist aggression against Palestine, and it's how most of the world understands the Palestinian issue. And because of this, like bringing in right of return and Palestinians who are originally from Israel just kind of complicates people's narrative and understanding. Another major issue is that a lot of the times what Zionists will do is say that the right of return somehow means that you are calling for the complete, what's the word? They use it all the time. The destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And so calling for right of return often comes with false and distracting accusations of anti-Jewish bigotry. However, when we like take a step back and understand the situation, what they're really saying is that an indigenous population who has been forced off of their land and prevented from returning is not allowed to come back to their land solely based on their national identity. And so this actually, the denial of right of return is itself racist, and we should not be kind of distracted or put on the defensive if people who are pro-Israel and against the right of return somehow accuse us of bigotry for supporting indigenous people and refugees being able to return to their homes. And there's a reason that this accusation comes up so strongly, which is because avoiding Palestinian right of return is actually one of the ultimate goals of the Zionist project, which wants to have the maximal amount of land of historic Palestine with the smallest number of Palestinians. And so having Palestinians return to their land disrupts that process. If we believe in democracy and one person, one vote, the fact that Palestinians as a whole, including the refugee population, comprise a majority of the population inside Israel and Palestine would mean that Israel's form of supremacy over Palestinians would end if it chose to operate under a true democracy. And so this is what's actually at stake, and Israel knows this, which is why it tries to kind of project very intense accusations on activists who are actually seeking principles or politics that we would support for most populations. Like any refugee should be able to return to their home after a war. Anyone who is forcibly displaced from their home should be able to return to their homes in times of peace and receive reparations for those experiences. It's simply not acceptable to say that a refugee can't go back to their home just because they are Palestinian. That is fundamentally racist and colonialist. So another thing to understand is that if we focus only on the occupation, that actually winds up bolstering Israel's larger colonial project, which, as I mentioned, is seeking to maintain the maximum amount of land with the minimum amount of Palestinians. And so this means that we can't simply stop our understanding of Palestine at the West Bank or Gaza, or even present-day Israel. But we need to understand that Palestine is as broad as its diaspora and its populations. So we especially need to think about Palestinians who, for 73 years, have lived in refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, who in many cases have fled wars or economic depression in these places, risking their lives to flee across the Mediterranean to Greece and other parts of Europe. And that none of these Palestinians should be living in these situations of, I don't know, I don't know how many of you have seen a refugee camp. It is not something that anybody should have to live in or experience. And so if we are not kind of centering the most oppressed population within the Palestinian diaspora, who are refugees, specifically those living in the Middle East outside of Palestine, or who are forced to risk their lives and in some cases die fleeing to Europe, then we're not actually addressing justice for the entire Palestinian population. And this takes us to kind of an understanding of the so-called peace process, or one state and two state. So let's say that tomorrow somehow Israel says, okay, fine. Palestinians, we're going to give you a real state. It will be in the entirety of the West Bank and Gaza. And you can control your borders. You can even have a military. Israel still walks away with having stolen 78% of historic Palestine. And I guarantee you that in this scenario, Israel will not say, oh, yes, Palestinians who came from Jaffa or Haifa or Akka, come back in your millions and reclaim your land. No, they'll say, okay, you guys have a Palestinian state now, so you can go live in the West Bank and Gaza with the rest of your people. This still would hold in place the fundamental injustice of denying indigenous people the ability to live on the land in which they're originally from. It's not enough to say that, okay, you have Ramallah or you have Bethlehem, go live there. If you're originally from Jerusalem and your family lived there for hundreds of years, or if you're from Haifa and you lived by the sea, or if you're from Akka and your family made their living off of fishing, it's the equivalent of maybe saying, actually, I know what the equivalent would be, because the United States is its own occupied territory, but we all know what home means to us. We know that if we were pushed out of our homes and forcibly kept from returning, that if somebody said, okay, well, you can't come back to your home, but here's this piece of land that's 100 miles away, like, why can't you accept that? Like, none of us would accept that. So we can't accept that condition that's being imposed upon Palestinians. And so what I want to stress here is that, I don't know, just the urgency of this moment that we're in requires us to think in much more expansive ways than the limited political discourse that we're currently stuck in. And what I mean by that is, for at least 30 years, we've been stuck in language of a peace process and two states and Palestinian Authority and security coordination and even settlements. And for 20 years, 30 years rather, none of these policies have stopped. The occupation has actually gotten much more entrenched. And so it's just staying stuck in this narrative winds up, as I said, reinforcing the bigger kind of colonial project, which is maximum land with minimal people. And so we need to think much more broadly and expansive about what freedom and justice can mean in occupied Palestine. And fortunately, we don't, again, have to invent new ideas. As I said, the oppressed people of the world have thought very deeply about what liberation looks like for us. And in the beginning of the Palestinian Revolution, the major Palestinian parties declared that we are seeking a single democratic state that supports both Palestinians and Jewish people living on the land, that is a secular state that's not dominated by religious supremacy or ideology, and that we accept this even if many of the people who are currently on our land are colonizers. And to me, this is a very kind of clear, simple political project: one state for everybody and democracy. Um, and you would not know that this was a kind of the what's the word? Consensus position of the Palestinian liberation movement, based on what we hear from Zionists who claim that, okay, Palestinian liberation means the complete erasure of Israelis and Jewish people from the land. And again, it's very intentional that this is how people, the everyday person, understands what Palestinian liberation means. Because again, if we believe in democracy, if we believe in freedom and justice, I don't see how two separate states, one of which denies rights to its indigenous population, is a form of justice. But democracy and a shared state for all should be a very kind of easy platform to get behind. However, it's due to the kind of, again, smears and false accusations that come if one raises the prospect of one democratic state, that make it difficult to speak about. And it's in a lot of cases, what we're dealing with as people who support Palestine is a smoke and mirrors campaign, where if Zionists put out enough noise, it seems like what we're calling for is something that is terrible or crazy or unrealistic. Whereas at the end of the day, the asks of the Palestinian movement: an end to military occupation, full legal equality within Israel, and the right of return of refugees are basic principles that anybody who believes in human rights should support and uphold. So it's our responsibility to push through the kind of noise that comes when we try to advocate for actual freedom for Palestinians, and to not get caught up in the kind of false accusations and us being put on the defensive. So I want to start wrapping up my remarks so we can move into discussion shortly. But there's a few things I'd like to share before I do that, or as I do that. One is just understanding in a different way the systems and processes that we are experiencing both in the US as Black people and in Palestine, and really around the world. And this has to do with the notion of enclosure. So when we think about what happened when European settlers came to this territory and colonized indigenous people's land, it was an act of enclosure. It was taking resources and land and space that indigenous people viewed as a common space, and goods for all, and putting up fences saying, okay, this is my land, that's your land. You can't access the resources that were here that you used to have unlimited access to. And they put up more fences and more enclosures and more fences and more enclosures until indigenous people were pushed into the tiny reservations that I showed you on the map at the beginning of this talk. It's also worth noting that indigenous people are the most incarcerated population per capita in this country, even more than Black people. That this is not an accident. What it means is that people who cannot tolerate conditions of forced impoverishment and colonization in the open air prisons of a reservation are confined or enclosed in an actual prison. Enclosure is also how Europeans captured Africans from lands in which we were free and indigenous, held us in prisons along the West African coast, kidnapped us as cattle across the ocean in the bottom of slave ships, which also were enclosures, and then trapped us in a new land under a system of racial supremacy and within a system of structural poverty, all with no way out. Enclosure. Once we were enclosed in this country, we were stuck within a system in which our bodies and families were controlled by Europeans and by the profit motive. At the end of that system, the people who were African before slavery and who became Black were still trapped in this territory and now forced to participate in a system of low-wage labor without the infrastructure we needed to survive. And so it's also no accident that there are hundreds of thousands of Black people in prisons today, because it's the same kind of principle. If you can't, well, one, we can't structurally survive under the conditions in which we live. And so if you either try to resist in the level of the Black Panthers and seeking like a freedom and self-determination, or if you seek another way out of the system, kind of what we refer to as crime, you wind up in jail and closed. And for the common relative of Black and indigenous people, the Palestinians, the Israeli process of colonialization and occupation is also one of enclosure. Drawing an artificial line on a map to say that the bigger, more fertile piece of this land is mine, and the smaller, more arid piece of land is yours, is a form of enclosure to a population that was largely agricultural, largely community and village-based, and did not have as strict notions of borders. Borders themselves are an act of enclosure. I've heard from many Palestinians or people in the region that there used to be days where you could have coffee in Haifa and have dinner in Beirut. And if you were feeling adventurous, go and have dessert in Damascus, which is structurally impossible today based on the way that borders have enclosed the indigenous people of the so-called Middle East. And so I just want to stress, and even when we think about the separation wall, when we think about settlements, when we think about refugee camps, and when we think about the 2 million people trapped inside Gaza's open air prison, these are all forms of enclosure. And so it's not random or isolated that enclosure is a common experience across these struggles and peoples. Enclosure is the literal embodiment of an economic system that is seeking ever expanding profits out of human life and labor, out of natural resources and out of land. In order to make more, you have to own more. In order to own more, everyone else has to have less. And so in order to make the most profit, you need to have the highest set of exploitable land, labor, and resources. And in order to do that, you have to push as much people and natural life and resources into the most manageable box as possible, enclosure. And so I opened up this talk saying that we are in a dire moment of shrinking political space for each of these movements. And what I want to end with is the notion that we need to seek out any conditions and support any types of projects that provide openings for these movements to experience freedom, to wrest themselves free, or at least a little bit more free from the systems that hold us down. And so where are those openings? Those openings are around abolition of prisons and police, which opens up the conversation to be more expansive around how can we invest these billions of dollars that go into oppressing people into systems and institutions and structures that actually support people. There are openings around reparations, excuse me, which I'll speak to a little bit more just shortly. Well, I'll speak to it now, actually. And so what I mean here is we need to start taking sets of actions, building campaigns that widen everybody's sense of what's possible for our future. And specifically that do so in a way that gets us to a point in which the oppressed and colonized people of the third world are actually able to live in freedom and dignity, to have experienced repair from centuries of colonialism and oppression, and who are able to just live in the ways in which we determine best for our own communities. And so what do some of those radical departures look like? One of these things would be, let's see. Yeah, as I said before, a pan kind of European push for accountability for colonialism and reparations for the entire colonized world. And so what that would look like is a campaign across everywhere that European descendants hold power, of seeking to take the money and resources that were extracted from indigenous land and peoples, specifically the African continent, which was entirely looted over the last century and a half, and reinvesting that money back into those communities and struggles. What this means, what could look like, is within your city, trying to see if you can organize your neighbors to undo the ways in which the indigenous people's commons were enclosed. And what I mean by that is, let's take a plot of land and the house that you live in. You might have a backyard and a fence around it. This entire kind of setup is a manifestation of colonialism and enclosure of indigenous land. So what does it look like to try to open up? I mean, I'm dreaming big here. Let's just say you organize an entire block to open up all of the land in the backyard to be a common space for Black and Indigenous people to plant their own food, to sustain their own communities, as a starting point of trying to undo some of the systems of violence and oppression that we're currently living under. Or more broadly, what would it look like to start organizing a campaign for the people who are descendants of European settlers to return to Europe and to cede the land and resources back to indigenous people and to Black folks? Because when we talk about just the right of return, there's currently very few examples of people who have benefited from colonialism, like materially removing themselves from that dynamic. And so, for example, you might not know this, but Germany is actually one of the largest sites for Israeli expats who say we don't want to live in this oppressive country. Many of us came from Germany, and so Germany becomes our home. Many of you come from Germany or the Netherlands or France or Sweden. But what would it look like to say, okay, in order to actually undo this oppressive structure and system that we live under, and to say, okay, we have unfairly benefited from this system as settlers or the descendants of them, let's wage a campaign to move our families back to Europe and to return land to those that to whom it belongs. That would be a significant kind of shift in how we understand the future that is possible. And the future that I hope is possible is one in which the oppressed people of this territory can live and just with the ability to determine lives for ourselves. And so, and another notion here is just pushing for more openness of mobility for the victims of colonialism. It makes absolutely no sense that as occupied and colonized people, we tend to hold passports that leave us unable to leave our countries if we would like to, and to live somewhere where we can find a decent life. While those who are the descendants of colonizing countries have passports that enable them to travel anywhere in the world. So I'm specifically thinking here of what would it look like if there was a movement to, for example, give European passports to any descendant of the African slave trade that was perpetrated by Europe, which would allow people who live in the Caribbean or Latin America the ability to travel to countries or live in places which they currently don't have access to. What would it look like for, in a similar kind of context, for those who were divided up by Britain and France in the Middle East to be able to have the same mobility as the people who colonized them? What I'm not saying here is that we should all become European citizens, but what I am saying is that we need to start kind of exposing just the power imbalances and the structural dynamics that continue to keep the colonized and the occupied oppressed, and that continue to allow the descendants of the colonizers free reign to control the entire world. So I think I will kind of pause here for Q&A. But yeah, I hope that this generated some new and interesting kind of thoughts or ideas for you all.
Thank you so much, Kristian. So many good things to think about and really analyze for ourselves and like reflect for ourselves. Thank you so much for everything that was said. For our first questions, one of them is from Barb, and they're asking, in both injustices with Black persons and Palestinian power seems to be the core of racism. In my life in the US, we are trying to get more power for justice. In Palestine, what is happening for increase of power for the common person?
Yeah, that's just it's the answer to this question is sad, which is why I'm kind of like hesitating. But so I have not been to Palestine myself since 2015. I was denied entry last time I tried to go 2 years ago. But I have spent a lot of time in Lebanon in the Palestinian refugee camps. And this is an example of when I say we need to have a broader conception of Palestine when we talk about it. I'm answering your question by talking about Palestinians living in Lebanon, who right now, I mean, from the start, lived under a system in which they experienced massive amount of racism from the Lebanese state, where the Palestinian camps are viewed and treated in the same way that many Americans view and treat Black communities, as dangerous, as full of criminals and drugs, too scary to enter. And add into that context the way in which the Lebanese economy is literally falling apart. The last time that I was in Lebanon, practically every young Palestinian that I spoke to, they didn't say they were depressed, but that's honestly the sense that you get from talking to them. And most people were asking, Kristian, how do I get out of here? How do I get to Europe? How do I get to the United States? And this is the case in Gaza, where people are smuggling themselves out of the strip and fleeing across the sea. It's the case for Palestinians who survived or tried to survive through war in Syria. And this is in the context in which the Trump administration is trying to take the right of return off the table. And so all of this is to say that I do not see anything right now that is increasing power for the common Palestinian, which oddly enough is happening at a time where, we did see an increase in support for the Palestinian struggle here in the US and in other Western states. But that is a contradiction that we're sitting with, where there's actually very little that is happening that is increasing power or the sense of hope or possibility for Palestinians living in the region. And I meant to say that if there are any Palestinians on the call who would like to kind of respond to some of the ideas I raised, I would like to prioritize hearing from you. So if any Palestinian wants to answer that question about what's increasing power for the common Palestinian, I welcome that.
And just raise your hand and other hosts will unmute you. So while we wait, if people want to raise their hand, we can answer another question. And then if hands are raised, we can unmute them and they can speak too. So the next question is from Maddie. And she was saying, I'm curious to know why you use the term third world instead of global south or developing countries.
Yeah, there's no, for me, strong preference between global south and third world. To me, it's more that third world represents a moment, just a different political moment. It was the moment where, like, you see there was an intentional understanding that these three continents, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, were connected, where there were active liberation movements happening in literally every part of the globe, that were in connection with each other. And to me, this represented the peak of our political organizing and possibilities as colonized people. So to me, just third world is a way of honoring that legacy and set of struggles. Yeah. And I don't like developing world because yeah, I know that to me tends to hide the actual systems and histories and structures that allowed Europe to be developed and wealthy, and the rest of the world to be underdeveloped and poor. Yeah, so we might think about terminology that helps kind of illuminate those power dynamics in a clearer way for everybody.
Thank you, Kristian. I think that's a really good clarification for that. We have a question from Virgil asking, how do you envision reparations happening for Palestinians, Blacks, and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, for me, I don't see this happening in the absence of a global movement. Um, um, I see this happening in the context of the descendants of enslaved people seeking reparations from the United States, of Haiti and Haitians seeking reparations from France for the literal centuries of forced impoverishment. For those who don't know, after the Haitians liberated themselves from French colonialism and slavery, France demanded that they paid some equivalent of billions of dollars today in debt for the goods that France lost in losing its slave colony. And so the reason that Haiti is the poorest country in this hemisphere is a direct result of France seeking reparations for Haitians repairing their own system of slavery. And France refuses to pay back this money. Because, and the point about reparations and the reason that literally no colonial power has paid it out is because the second that one colonial power pays $1 to one colonized people, everybody else will understand that they have the ability to organize for that as well, and the right to demand it. And this is connected to why Israel is so adamant about resisting the right of return. Because the second that one Palestinian refugee from Badawi camp in Lebanon is able to repatriate to historic and occupied Palestine, that opens up the door for every refugee to do so. And so it is our right as colonized people to demand justice for the oppressions that we experienced. And so to me, like reparations for Black folks, right of return for Palestinians, which is a form of repair, but also needs to include monetary reparations for literally generations of lost wealth. And what I mean by this is 80 years ago, a family might have had enough land to sustain them, not only themselves, but also to sell some of their goods to take an income. And 80 years later are living an entire family in a like small set of apartments in a refugee camp with literally no money. When Palestine is free and when there is justice and democracy, which means when the refugees return, it can't simply be, okay, we kept you out, we let you back, just like live your life. There's actually going to need to be many different programs of reparations for lost wealth, building institutions to address the psychological distress that Palestinians have experienced by Zionists for 80 years. There need to be institutions that help level the educational disparities between the different populations. There needs to be a very deep and robust series and practices of reparations in that context. And so I think if we can generate a sense across the colonized people of the third world or the global south that we are owed reparations and will not stop organizing until we receive them, right of return will be part of that process. Reparations for Black folks will be part of that process. But the only way in order for us to actually make it happen is if there's a global and coordinated movement for it. And that includes, as I said at the start, Europeans organizing internally for their own kind of countries to participate in this process of reparations.
Thank you so much, Kristian. So we are going to just do a few more questions and then we can do closing. This question is saying, based on your suggestion, should African American Blacks return to African countries from which their ancestors were taken?
Yeah, so the difficulty of this question is that it's very hard for us to know where we were taken from. There were not countries when slavery started. We lived in villages and tribes. And this is actually very similar to the Palestinian context. I'm going to take a detour for a moment, but we frequently hear Zionists say there was no Palestine. As a way of somehow saying that because there was not a formal state that was recognized as Palestine, that there were no Palestinians or there was no distinctive kind of cultural community in this place. That's because in this moment, before nation states existed, that's not how we thought of ourselves, but we still were indigenous to lands and different places. And so for African Americans and Black folks, I mean, that should be part of our right, if we choose, that we are resourced to return to generally West Africa. But the issue here is that, and to be honest, this is the issue with the Zionist project. We as Black people, yes, we are indigenous to Africa, generally to West Africa. But we have been away for so long that the way in which we return to the land needs to be in ways that respect and support the indigenous populations who were not stolen and who still live there. So it would be inappropriate for a movement of Black folks here to say, okay, Ghana, we're coming for you. And when we get there, we need this much land. We're setting up our own political system. The people that are already there need to go, or if they stay, we're going to put like these laws in place that keep them like below us. That's the equivalent of the Zionist project in Palestine. So I think part of repair in this context means understanding that we are not going to regain our previously indigenous status. We're not going to return to the way that life or things were before colonialism and slavery. And that we need to work in a broader, more collective way with the indigenous populations of the lands in which we're from to envision a world where we can actually experience freedom. But it's not going to come through asserting the dominance of diaspora population upon the indigenous population.
Thank you so much, Kristian. So our president has a question that she wanted to ask directly.
Oh, I didn't know if I would be on speaker or not. My question, Kristian, is you bring up some clearly very radical potential solutions to the incredibly complex state of what it is today for Indigenous Blacks and Palestinians. Is there any support whatsoever on the part of legislators anywhere in the United States?
I mean, probably there is somewhere to a small degree, but by and large, all of these institutions like the underlying premise of them is that they, what am I trying to say? They were built to support a colonial system, and so there's only so much that they can do to actually support our needs. And as an example of this, let's take Detroit, the largest Black city in the country. It's like the population is 80% Black. The city council there fundamentally does things that undermines the actual needs of the Black population. They did not oppose water shutoffs in any serious way. They sold off different services of the city that forced Detroiters into like a system of austerity. And even during the recent set of protests, we just saw violence against a Black controlled police department against a majority Black population. And so this takes me to a point that I wanted to make earlier and I'm losing it, but where I'll go with this is, I think it's important in this context to support just Black folks who are trying to determine their own communities. And what I mean by that is, in Detroit, for example, and I'll actually talk about this in a moment, there's a very large movement of Black farmers to buy and reclaim land to use as community farm and garden spaces. So in ways that bring kind of food of nutrition to the community. It's a local economy that doesn't rely on like corporations to exist. And it allows people to be kind of, oh, here's where I was going with this, to be self-sufficient. Because I mean, there's many revolutionaries who say that the person who feeds you controls you. And so if you're not in control of being able to feed yourself, then you are going to be at the will and whims of other people's politics and social structures and economic structures. And so I think it's important to try to push our different politicians to support Black and Indigenous folks. But I also think that if we invest in the projects where Black folks are trying to figure that out for themselves, that will generate the leadership that people need for their own communities. It doesn't need to come from outside of the community.
So in other words, it's a bubble, you're advocating a bubbling up from the ground up, grassroots kinds of things. Understood.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Janet. We will have time for this one last question and then closing. Dennis from our board says, Kristian, thank you for your superb, enlightening presentation. The question is, wondering what your work at Palestine Legal primarily entails, and noticing that you've traveled to South Africa. Do you tend to join Jimmy Carter in viewing that Palestinians are experiencing apartheid? And do you also draw some parallels to what many Blacks are experiencing in the US today?
Yes, so quickly I'll put on my Palestine Legal hat because I haven't been wearing it during this talk. But I am the communications manager at Palestine Legal, and we work to support the movement for Palestinian rights here in the US. So activists who experience any form of backlash for their advocacy for Palestine, whether that's on campus or in the community, we seek to provide pro bono legal support to. We keep track of the different efforts to legislate against the movement for Palestinian freedom, whether that's the form of anti-BDS laws or laws that redefine criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And yeah, that's kind of the nexus in which we operate. Regarding South Africa, so most of the places I've been to outside of the country, I've been invited to because of my work around Black and Palestinian solidarity. South Africa being one of those places, Brazil being another. And yeah, I mean, with the apartheid question, I think one thing it's important for people to understand is there is like an international legal definition of apartheid. that is broader than the South African experience of apartheid. And so when I say that Israel is practicing apartheid against Palestinians, I'm looking at this broader international definition, which applies to Israel. It applies to the United States, how it treats Black folks and indigenous people. It applies to South Africa, or applied to South Africa. And even in places like Brazil, where 50% of the population is Afro-descendant, Brazil actually received the largest number of enslaved Africans of the whole slave trade. And there's a system of racial apartheid there as well, where Black folks are also the poorest, most heavily policed, imprisoned, most likely to experience state violence. And so these are kind of unifying factors across various geographies and struggles, which is why I am saying that we need to be a lot more cohesive and not just limiting ourselves to one nation and one struggle when we talk about freedom and liberation.
Thank you, Kristian. Thank you so much for answering those questions all so very well. And so now we are closing Q&A, and specifically Kristian for his talks, he has an ask for the participants to donate to an organization, and there's an organization that he's going to talk about now. And at the end of his discussion, we asked for everyone to put in the chat a pledge of $10+ that you're willing to donate to this organization. And in the chat, we will also place where you can go to donate.
Cool, thanks, Maya. So yeah, I want to end with this notion of where is freedom expanding in the Black community in this moment. And that is specifically happening in Detroit, which, as I've said many times, is the largest Black city in the country. And when I talk about this bubbling up thing that Janet mentioned, the notion here is that if the city with the largest and highest concentration of Black people in this country can figure out how to determine its own way of living in a way that suits the actual needs of the people, that will naturally have an effect of opening the struggle for freedom for oppressed people everywhere. And I want to help you understand this by first showing you a 2-minute video of an urban farm in Detroit that's called Feed 'em Freedom.
Where we are right now is called Feed 'em Freedom Growers, and it is the organization of Wayne and Myrtle Curtis. We're on the east side of Detroit, and as you can see behind me, there's a lot of gardening that's going on.
We started to realize how it related to our autonomy, how it related to understanding our biological existence.
In this garden, there's opportunity not only to feed themselves and for people in the neighborhood to feed themselves from the garden if they work the garden and help, but it's also an opportunity to come together with the garden. And one of the things that's really special about this area is it's not too far from what's called Grosse Pointe, Michigan. It's about 1.5 miles away, which is one of the richest places in Michigan, if not the country. And people are moving into this area because it's close to the river, and a lot of people being displaced.
They're restructuring, rezoning, bringing in new financial institutions, governments changing. So how does that affect us? Foreclosures.
We're trying to figure out how we can be supportive of people to stay in their homes and continue to live with their families like they always have. One of the neighbors almost lost her house, and it was a 2-year effort in this very garden where hundreds of people gathered to resist the takeover of the home.
She won because of the support of the neighborhood.
That is going on all over the city. People, the thing that I really love about Detroit is what I call Detroit spirit, and that's the spirit of determination.
So I share that just to give you an example of the type of incredibly visionary, transformative, like opening political work that's happening in Detroit. And we'll now just share a little bit about the organization that I'm asking people to donate to today. And that group is called the Detroit Black Food Security Network. Actually, it's the wrong tab. Yeah, so the Detroit Black Food Security Network is a network of Black farmers across the city of Detroit, including who I call Baba Wayne that you just saw in the video. And they are seeking to ensure that Detroit's Black population is food secure, with an understanding, as I said, that if you can control your own food, you have a better ability to control your own social and political destiny. And so food security means when all members of the community have easy access to adequate amounts of affordable, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food. And so one of the projects that the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is currently supporting is the development of a Detroit People's Food Co-op, which will be a cooperatively owned grocery store in a neighborhood called the North End of Detroit, in which the grocery store will work with many of the Black farms and urban farms across Detroit to source the materials and food as a way of building towards the self-determination of the Black community in Detroit. And so I'm asking you all to contribute to the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network in order to support the various projects that they're doing. Because as I said, it's if you've never been to Detroit, it's a little hard to understand, but hopefully you caught a glimpse from this video. But it's a city that has a very deep history of resistance to racism. It is a city in which the Black Panther Party and revolutionary Black auto union workers made very significant contributions to movements for global freedom. And it is a site that has systemically been disinvested from over the last 50 or 60 years since it became a Black controlled city. So they said, okay, you got your self-determination. Here you have your Black mayor, your Black fire department, your Black city council, your Black police department. We're just gonna take the money away from you all. And what that looked like is disinvestment that led to like the rise in crime and the turning our communities into not feeling safe. I will send a link to this video, by the way. But it also meant that in the 90s, for example, after decades of Detroit pushing a very Afrocentric curriculum, the state of Michigan said, okay, actually, you guys can't control your system of education. We're taking this away from you. We're controlling it. Similar dynamic with actually the city's finances itself. In the last decade, the state of Michigan, which is a Republican-controlled state at the time, managed the city of Detroit's finances because it claimed that Detroiters cannot figure out how to do that themselves. And so it's really important to support the work that's happening in Detroit because it's actually because of the disinvestment, there's a lot more space to engage in new and creative ideas and political and community-based projects. And because activists like Baba Wayne have been literally active in the movement for decades, there's just a very deep and rich understanding of dynamics happening to the city and of how to create new and visionary alternatives that actually bring about self-determination for everybody. And so this is an example of the type of space that I hope, and don't know how, but hope starts to open up in the context of Palestine. But for today, I'm asking folks to pledge to contribute to to this group. And what I'll do is add up what I see as the pledges here and just let them know to expect this kind of lump sum on behalf of Middle East Peace Now to this work.
And as this is Maya here, as a board member, what I want to just say is that after listening to everything that Kristian has said, I think this is a really perfect example and opportunity to practice reparations, to actively practice reparations. And so why we're asking people to pledge is to hold each other accountable. And to, when we pledge this in the chat, then we can hold ourselves and each other accountable to make today an active step towards reparations and intersectionality in our work. And Kristian will post right now the website for donations in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the video as well. Here is the link to donate, and then this is the link to just the food security network more broadly. And yeah, there's reparations. It's a very wide and kind of broad process. It can involve things such as providing resources to Black and Indigenous groups that are seeking self-determination. It can mean if you have access to generational wealth in the form of land, entrusting that land to the indigenous people of that area, or to community organizations that are working for the benefit of their communities. And it's a very wide and broad thing. And so I just encourage us to think very deeply about how we can practice this in a more kind of consistent basis.
Follow-up email to this forum. We will post again the donation page, this YouTube video, and the recording of this forum.
So far, it looks like we have, I hope I did my math right, but let's just say at least $250 in pledges. It might be a little bit more than that. So deeply appreciate that. And yeah, well, Maya, maybe if you can ask folks to write back, I gave this much, we can then add up a final tally at the end.
Perfect.
I think at this point I'm going to stop the recording before Janet gets into the details of wrap up and looking toward MEPN's forum for next month. So just in closing of the recording, thank you so much, Kristian, for sharing your insight and wisdom. I think all of us here learned so much and look forward to hopefully hearing from you in the future and continuing learning. Thank you.